Welcome to Conversations on Sustainability, the podcast where we discuss issues surrounding sustainability, the environment, as well as the individuals and organizations working to create positive change. I'm your host, Henry Palmer. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our second episode of Conversations on Sustainability. Today, we're talking about ocean plastics and microplastic pollution. For context, with ocean plastics and microplastic pollution, every medium where we're now looking for microplastics, we're finding them, from the poles to the equators, in our oceans, and really in our lakes right around the corner from you. So to discuss this topic, I'm joined today by Rachael Miller, an expert in this field. So Rachael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
To give you some background on Rachael, I mean, she is an absolute expert in this field. She's an expedition scientist, an inventor, National Geographic Explorer, and part of the Explorers Club fellows, and working to really get out there and protect our oceans. She's the founder of the Rozalia Project for a Clean Ocean, a nonprofit working to solve the problems of marine debris, and co-inventor of the Cora Ball. Rachael's out there really on the front lines, and she's really just, her research is helping push this subject forward. So we're talking about ocean pollution, plastics pollution in the ocean, how it's getting there, and what you've seen with the work you've done.
Thank you for that generous introduction. So thinking about the problem of marine debris, it's pretty complex. So that kind of helps to get going, is just to acknowledge its complexity. And there are some big categories of marine debris that we can talk about, or that Rozalia Project has worked on. And so one of them, for example, is derelict fishing gear. Yeah. So that's something we work on. That's all different types of fishing gear that is no longer actively fishing, but lingers in whatever waterway in which it was deployed. And sometimes actually all the time it moves around. Derelict fishing gear is interesting and scary in that while it may not be the most marine debris, it does count for a lot of tonnage, but it's the most dangerous to sea creatures.
Exactly.
Arguably, there are the least number of individual people who have their hands on this stuff. So that's one category. Another category, and this involves every human pretty much, is consumer debris, in some countries more than others. And what I mean by consumer debris would be something related to packaging, especially food and beverage packaging. So these are the single-use plastics that we have been and need to be talking about and finding solutions for, in terms of their life cycle and how long they need to last and how they should be used and disposed of.
Yeah.
But also things like balloons, which are actually quite a big marine debris problem. Again, not necessarily in numbers, although it is shocking how many balloons we find on our expeditions. They are quite dangerous to sea creatures.
And of course, these are items that just tend to sort of fly under the radar. You know, you say balloons, and it's just this innocent item, but then all of a sudden, now you're picking them up. You know, on your expeditions, you're finding them on the beaches. You're finding them as part of this massive plastics problem.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. We collect data with every single piece of trash that we pick up. And this year, we'll cross the 1 million pieces mark with Rozalia Project. And so we've got just a very large Excel spreadsheet that lists out everything we found. And while there's a fair amount of surprising finds, some really are more archaeology than trash, which is always a highlight for me. But a lot of it is surprisingly consistent. Mm-hmm. And infuriating, because it feels like balloons don't need to be found on remote islands. The consistency is something that gives me hope, I have to say. And the consumer debris, because it is easier to talk about broad problems than something where I'm like, oh, we found one freezer floating in the Gulf of Maine once. That's not a problem we're going to spend time trying to solve.
Yeah.
But finding 587 single-use water bottles on an uninhabited remote island on a beach the length of a short block in Manhattan, that is a problem that we should be working to solve. So that's in the consumer debris. And then speaking of potentially overwhelming problems, the third category that Rozalia Project works on, and that I personally have spent a very long and focused time working on, has to do with microplastics. So when we say microplastics, we've got that's a heading category. And in there are certain types. So there's one that we would call primary microplastics that includes little bits of synthetic material that started their lives small. And the small that we're using to describe micro is 5 millimeters, which roughly is half the size of your pinky nail, roughly, which is actually kind of big once you start to look at the microplastics that are in, especially our ocean. At any rate, primary microplastics would include something quasi-familiar like glitter. One individual piece of glitter, we're mostly made of plastic, that would be a primary microplastic. It was manufactured that small, that's what it is. Another would be a microbead, now banned for the last couple of years. Those were little plastic spheres that showed up in exfoliating products for your face or body wash and toothpaste. So those are banned in the US, not necessarily worldwide, but thanks to supply chain challenges, when whole countries start to make those changes, there's a knock-on effect. Thank goodness. And resin pellets. So those two I just talked about, you'd consider post-consumer. Resin pellets, some people call nurdles, but the real term is resin pellet. What this is it looks like a bead that you'd make like a kid's bracelet with, but there's no hole in it. So very small, little kind of neutral colored piece of plastic, usually kind of a little mini cylinder. That's the raw material for plastic manufacturing. So that's like this pen case before it became a pen case. It was just transported around as lots and lots of big, huge bags of resin pellets. Absolutely. Or my phone case or whatever. Then there are secondary microplastics. So that would be little chunks, fragments, little bits of fiber, or little bits of film that have dropped off or broken off or cut off of something larger. So pretty obvious.
We have all of this waste, we're finding in the ocean and entering the ocean. But I think your point of differentiating and helping differentiate that, things like glitter are a problem, but they start off their life small and so on. And then, of course, you have the other pieces that are over time breaking down and so on. And of course, the other piece that we're seeing with this is those pieces of plastics being ingested, right? Being ingested by marine life and so on. Of course, they're hugely toxic to the animals, but of course, then that enters the food chain. And of course, we're now finding that on our dinner plates and how frightening that is. So I think that's just understanding as we think about the world of plastics, how these things can move down the pipeline. They end up in our oceans and what happens to that. And then how ultimately it comes back. And now we're eating a, credit card's worth of plastic a week or whatever that might be. When we visualize it like that, that's, but that's how it's
crazy,
coming back to us, isn't it?
And what I appreciate what you talked about is sort of thinking of like pipeline, because it's kind of different depending on what we're talking about. And some of it is more inadvertent than others. So there's secondary microplastics. You could picture this real easily, that there's an overflowing trash can in a city. We've all seen it. It's pretty horrific. I just have to say, my guess is your listeners already know that balancing your bottle on top of a tower of trash does not constitute throwing it away.
Yeah.
So overflowing trash can, trash on the ground, especially in a busy place, trucks and buses and cars roll by and smash it into lots of pieces, though technically it's still kind of innocently just sitting there as like medium-sized fragments of plastic and stuff in the gutter. Big rainstorm comes, boom, straight away, this stuff then gets transported down almost a physical pipeline through the sewer into the waterways. And we used to partner with, actually we still partner with Courageous Sailing right there in Boston. And one day we were working with kids and we were looking at floating debris, and we had these pool skimmers that we use as nets to investigate. And we had one of those New England deluges, like the summer storm.
Oh yeah.
It's been 105 degrees, and then boom, for like 20 minutes, you couldn't breathe if you looked up in the sky, like you'd need a scuba tank. So it did that. And we know that that is a real storm drain overflow event that the wastewater treatment, the normal wastewater treatment channels can't take that. All that can't be treated. And so what happens is that an incredible amount of this runoff from the streets goes like, it's an overflow situation, and it goes straight out into, in this case, Boston Harbor. And we were right near one of those overflow pipes. And we sat there and we watched it happen. Bags, cigarettes, food wrappers. It was every 2 seconds, something else would come out and the kids would grab it with the net and we'd pull it onto the dock. But that was the stuff we could see. And the reality is that mixed up in the stuff that we can see is a lot of this that we can't. And that's a pretty interesting input that I think maybe people don't think about, because it's like quasi inadvertent. Nobody orders the deluge, and waste management is very complicated to like treat every single drop of water that runs off our streets. And there's a lot of things there.
Being in Boston and being around the rivers a lot myself, and I've spent too much time rowing and so on. I lived that experience, so closely, because you see this, massive deluge, and then it just is all flooding in, and it's floating by you. And of course, that's just emptying out into the harbor. And that's just, as you say, just what we can see. And then here you are. And this is kind of how these plastics are ending up in our oceans. And then, and how that kind of starts that sort of cycle of them moving around.
And what the storm runoff microplastic as an input is really just one part. And that's kind of it's really quite, it's a little bit of carelessness on individuals' parts, but it's also a little bit of waste management infrastructure issues, perhaps not enough trash cans, not cleaned often enough. There's a little systems situation there. There's another one that's been discovered sort of quasi recently, really in the last 10 years, that is pretty fascinating. So can you picture when one of your garments, like your favorite t-shirt, goes kind of soft and threadbare a little bit?
Exactly.
So that happens. And I have to say, I had never thought about this before we learned about it. Well, what's happening is that our clothes, when that happens, they're essentially losing pieces of the fiber that they were made with. And a lot of that is happening in washing machines. So it's also happening when we just wear our clothes, and it's happening in dryers, but it seems to be, the majority does seem to be happening in washing machines. And this is crazy. So if it happens in washing machines, it means that these microfibers, now when I say microfiber, I mean all inclusively synthetics, because when you wear polyester or something, that microfiber is now part of the microplastics definition that we talked about. But also, we wear synthetic or naturally derived fibers like cotton, though interestingly, they're treated with chemicals that we wouldn't necessarily want to drink or feed to fish. So I'm going to say microfiber and microfiber pollution is collective, both plastic and non-plastic, but all what we'd say anthropogenic, which means man-made. And so this microfiber that breaks off your clothes in your wash goes out the drain, and it is managing to escape the wastewater treatment system, whether that's by fertilizer or by just being part of the effluent into rivers. And that's a really fascinating part of this problem, because these pieces are even smaller than the little bits of runoff from trucks running over pieces of.
And I think, what you've framed there as well is, when we think about how many of our clothes are made of synthetics, whether it's especially athletic gear and so on, that is just, and of course goes in the wash, and then it's immediately shedding and so on. Not to mention, plastics do get recycled at some stage, often get turned into fleece and shredded, because you can't totally replace a single-use plastic bottle. It doesn't turn back into another single-use plastic bottle. It oftentimes turns into a fleece jacket and so on. And now, from what you're expressing, this ends up in the washing machine, and now these microfibers are being shed. Now you've really been at the forefront of looking at this, and as you mentioned, this is something new that this is new, kind of terrifying, and how did we overlook this piece that you've started to look into? Tell me a bit more
Yeah,
about the kind of what you've seen and the other work that you're doing kind of around solving some of these problems.
so we're not the ones who discovered the problem. We'll acknowledge the University of Plymouth in the UK about 10 years ago, finding microfibers in some water samples and realizing that they were connected to our, let's say, collective textiles, our clothes, home textiles, and things like that. But we heard about the problem in around 2013, and it was one of those problems that just screamed at us.
Yeah.
You know, not like little speaking, it was full on scream. And so when we learned that, and we just thought, God, this is going to prove to be one of the biggest problems our ocean faces, just our public waterways face, is something this small and something that, like it or not, everyone who wears and washes clothes is part of. Not just the people who refrain from balancing their trash on open, overflowing trash cans. You know, we can all very easily avoid doing that.
Yeah.
We can improve our waste management, this municipal waste management system, so there's a lot less of that happening. But we need to wear clothes and we need to wash those clothes. And I'll state right here early, as a fellow water athlete, so my sport of choice being sailing, and I used to be a swimmer, and I'm not a competitive, but a very joyous recreational skier. But the basis of all of what I'm about to say is not to also vilify synthetic clothing, but it's to say that there is going to be a requirement for us to do the whole thing better. And for me, part of better does not include trying to move back to us all wearing cotton 100% of the time. It's impractical, and I actually don't think we can feed and clothe our world on our agriculture, knowing actually that we need 3 more planets just to feed everybody. So with that said, when we learned about the problem, we set about to do 3 things. One was to see if we could solve the problem as fast as possible, not entirely solve it, or at least start to solve it. 2, to raise awareness, not just as an education program, say for school kids, but to inspire people in the myriad industries in which we have no expertise, like materials science, and to say, well, can our clothes be more resilient? And start stopping the problem upstream of consumers. And then with manufacturers of our washing machines, and then with perhaps downstream with wastewater treatment plants. So we wanted to inspire innovation by spreading the word. And the third was to contribute to what was at the time very, very scant scientific knowledge about the problem. And so we did that last part, by embarking on trying to figure out what microfiber looked like in the wild, and to see its relationship with anything, population, a particular industry, something bathymetric, so like the bottom of the water, or something geographic or topographic. And so I'll just really quickly say the way we executed that at first was in 2016, we went to the Hudson River and we did one of the things that I love the most, which is expedition science on the water. And so we sampled the Hudson every 3 miles from Lake Tier of the Clouds, high in the Adirondack Mountains. Every 3 miles, we took surface samples until we got out to Ambrose Light, where the Atlantic and the Hudson meet. That was amazing. Like, what a cool experience and total privilege to know an entire river from where it starts to where it ends.
Well, let me just interrupt you quickly.
Yeah.
One of the bits that's been so interesting about your work is, and why I was so keen to sort of chat to you about this today, is that getting out there piece. There's this, you're out amongst it, gathering data and doing that research, and then you're producing a tremendous amount of work behind it and helping that discovery process. But I love that both sides of the coin piece, where you're out there on the expeditions and so on, really sampling and sort of studying it as you go, and then that just helps frame the whole piece that much better.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it was really inspiring for us, because concurrent to all of that was this development of the thing that was going to be our contribution to the solution list. And after considering the very obvious, which would be doing a filter, and rejecting that, because what we realized about a filter in a washing machine is, if we're going to catch something that is small, and I don't know that we even defined what these clothing-based microfibers are like, These could be 1/10 or even more than that, 1/50th the diameter of one strand of human hair. So this is something that you cannot, sometimes they're big, but a lot of them, you can't even see it without a microscope. And so a normal filter like a sieve or a screen, to be so small that it catches something that's even half the width of a human hair, would mean that we would flood. You would either have to stand at your washing machine and like scrape it or clean it or do something with the filter. We counted 4 minimum times per load, and nobody's like signing up for that, or it would just flood your basement or apartment. So we decided that that wasn't in our engineering wheelhouse, and it would also take a really long time. And in fact, that is the way part of these solutions needs to go, is inline washing machine filters. And there are now 7 years later, actually 8 years later, now finally starting to be some people are launching licensable inline filters for washing machines. But as far as I know, in the US, you can't buy a washing machine with a microfiber filter built in. Now there's some aftermarket filters that you could put on the wall and feed through, and those need cleaning every about 5 loads of laundry, so less onerous for sure. But we wanted something accessible, financially accessible like you didn't need a wall, because we have our washing machine and dryer in like a closet thing. Like we can't do an aftermarket filter. We physically can't do it. And we wanted it to be immediate because we knew it would serve our third purpose as well, is help spread the word. That just us saying isn't as effective as saying, hey, we've got a solution, like here's a thing, and this is what this problem's addressing. And so that's where the Cora Ball came in. This is the Cora Ball. So this is that other piece. This is what we came up with. Not necessarily easily in a snap, as often kind of invention and is iteration. But this is a solution, not the solution to microfiber pollution. And what you do is you put this little creature, people think it looks like a sea creature, and I'll explain why in a sec, we love that, into a washing machine, any washing machine, and it cruises around with your clothes, and the little bits of fiber that are floating around that break off your clothes can be caught in these stalks. So if you're thinking this looks like a sea creature, it's because it was inspired by coral itself. That when we came up to a sort of design block, like the thing that we had come up with at first just didn't work. Our first bunch of versions, it just didn't really work. We stopped. Okay, this isn't getting anywhere. And so we said, all right, what needs to happen here? And we realized that what needs to happen is we need to catch small things from moving water. Like that was the simplest way to state our problem, our challenge. And once we did that, we realized that coral totally achieves our goal. Coral is like stuck to a rock, and it collects small things from moving water. It naturally
filters, exactly.
It totally does. It is like the filter of the ocean. I mean, besides bivalves, but they're pumping. And we don't need a pump in this particular case because there's already a pump.
There's already movement, yeah.
Yeah, there's already motion. And again, that was also going to be a big engineering situation. I think the filters are going to need some kind of their own pump scenario or some moving parts in order to clean. But it wasn't bivalves that inspired us. It was actually coral. And that's why this kind of has a coral-like look to it.
And what's so interesting to me about your solution and so elegant is the simplicity of it, right? And I think that one of the things that we've talked about around these conversations about sustainability is access and ease. And you talked about how complicated some of those filters were, and it was involves installing and mounting, and and then obviously the expenses and so on. And what's amazing about the Cora Ball is it's an elegant, simple step in the right direction. This you take the Cora Ball, you pop it in your washing machine, and you let it go to work for you. And as you mentioned, it's not the end all solution, but it's a massive step in the right direction. And what's elegant about it in my mind is it's really hands off. And I thought the discussion of standing in front of your washing machine and you're either subjecting yourself to cleaning filters constantly or flooding your basement. And anyone who's, I've certainly flooded the basement with a washing machine. It's not a pretty situation.
No, it's awful.
You're in all sorts of trouble with, whether you're landlord or your spouse or whomever,
Yeah, it's not your best day.
No, exactly. And so that's what I think is so interesting about what you've done here is you've just made it, you've found a vehicle for people to combat this problem. This is a real thing. It's a growing concern where we're learning more and more about the impact of microfiber pollution. And here is a strong step in the right direction that
said.
Consumers can take today and just, drop it in and so on.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. That's exactly what we were after and totally appreciate it, that we wanted something that was immediate, something that was effective. We would have gone to market at 10% level of effectiveness, which is how strongly we felt about doing something about the problem immediately instead of just waiting. I think the more we look at almost any problem that happens at a complex level, waiting for a silver bullet is a bad idea, because then you just have 100% of the problem. It's just problem indefinitely. Whereas the Cora Ball has actually been shown by totally independent, completely hands-off, but peer-reviewed scientific testing to be up to 31% effective. We think there's other roles the Cora Ball can play even, besides just helping collect fiber. So one of them is that it reminds people that all of our homes are connected to our natural world. And in particular, our drains are linked to our public waterways. And if this even keeps a few people from pouring acetone, from flushing drugs down the whatever, toilet, the sink, anything, then that would be huge for me as well, because we did think about that. Any conversation that a family has when a kid says, "Hey, parent, why'd you put the dog toy in the washing machine?" What an awesome dual purpose to say, well, child, that's because our sinks and our drains go out to eventually just offshore of Boston Harbor.
And this brings us back to what we're discussing is just, all of these things, these pieces being connected, right? In that as you run your washing machine and as you use your sink and so on, it goes somewhere. And there's
consequences to what goes down it. Now, human waste, we figured that out. There's no consequence to that. I mean, none in the picture of what we're talking about. We figured it out. We figured out even like the Boston wastewater treatment plant is spectacular. There's even some parts of it that are solar powered, and I've gotten tours there. So that's been fun. Geeky fun, but yeah. So, we figured that out. But except for human waste, we have not figured it out. And if we haven't figured it out, that means that it's up to no good on the back end. So putting anything but human waste down or food waste down drains, nothing good is happening at the back end because it hasn't been figured out. Unless you know for sure that it has. And I can tell you that it hasn't. So it's a pretty interesting thing.
So Rachel, tell me, we've kind of gone from top to bottom here, starting with plastics and then into microplastics, into microfibers, into the Cora Ball and how that's making impact. If you had to leave listeners with one piece, one sort of a key takeaway that you would like to sort of impart on everyone, what would that be for you? And sort of tell us about that. Yeah,
it's a 2-part or a 3-part answer that it all basically means the same thing. So the phrase we use to describe this is lots of littles make a big. I want the takeaway to be lots of littles make a big. Lots of little tiny pieces of pollution add up to big pollution-related, big environmental problems. So that's on that side. But here's the thing. Lots of efforts that people make will add up to big impact. And that's both from an individual standpoint, so opportunities to reduce the amount of shedding that happens in your washing machine. So super easy, even before thinking about a Cora Ball, you can do a few things. Wash in cold water. First of all, just wash when it's needed. There's a lot of sort of American cultural habit of, if the clothes touches like if a garment touches a human, it gets washed. But the reality is, like we do a lot of afternoon sports. And so we come home, take a shower, and I may wear something from 7 p.m. until like midnight when I go to bed. And as long as I don't dribble my dinner on it, it could probably be worn the next 7 p.m. after I get out of a shower. So wash less, wash with cool water, adjust your detergent when you do that, so it's still effective. Things like do whole loads of laundry rather than small loads of laundry. You'll reduce your shedding and actually save on water and electricity. So those are some really good ones. If you have an opportunity to replace your washing machine, like don't throw out a good one, but when you replace it, front loaders are not only better from a water and electricity standpoint, but there's a big difference to the amount of shedding that happens in a front loader. Obviously, there are other options, like in addition, like using a Cora Ball. And I didn't even mention something exciting about a Cora Ball that came up in the last independent paper, and that's that Cora Ball helps reduce clothes shedding, helps reduce overall shedding in a wash load. And so the Cora Ball is not just collecting fibers, it's also preventing them from happening in the first place, which is awesome from the environment, but it's good for your clothes. It's good for you to not have to replace clothes. So those are some actions, but also to remember that corporations have a role to play too, and those are just run by individuals. So if you are someone with a connection to, or you're a decision maker in a company that's anywhere in the textile supply chain, there's opportunities for you to have an impact as well. And that's doing everything from bringing it up to a company that microfibers are something you care about, to actually being actively involved in making clothes more resilient, to understanding more about the problem, to engineering a good inline filter that you don't have to stand at the washing machine. So, even a small idea can have big impact when applied through particular channels, especially as we get to larger companies. So lots of littles making it big. That's not just about the bad or the good or just the individual, but it's this sort of big picture philosophy. So I hope that makes people feel better about learning about this problem, that everyone can be part of the solution at all different levels.
Well, Rachael, thank you so much for your time today and kind of going over everything, that you've been doing and learning about, and sort of helping shed some more light on these challenges and how it impacts, all of us. But I think that, just your point there of, lots of littles make it big, and these contributions add up, both in a positive and negative way. And, thank you so much for all your work with Rozalia Project and everything you're doing there. And, obviously the Cora Ball, phenomenal item. We have it at Lochtree.com. So come check it out where our podcast will be. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, tuning in with us all the way from New Zealand, and, tomorrow and so on. So this has been fantastic. Thank you again. And, look forward to following what you're up to and seeing sort of the next expeditions and the next pieces you're working on.
Thank you for bringing up these topics to share discussions about this and talk about the sort of the tough stuff and some of the solutions out there and what people can do to kind of keep it positive and move forward. It's important. Can't solve these problems unless we first understand them and then understand that we can solve them. So Absolutely. I appreciate what you're doing on that.